Hello students. Students, here at this session we are going to do the remaining specimens of your demonstrative experiments, which we also call as spottings. So here we are going to see the specimens that will be kept for spot E, F, G, H, I and J. Now before we start studying these specimens, let us just take a quick review of what we have done in the previous session. So in the previous session, we have done 4 spottings. We have done the specimens for spot A, B, C and D. So as I told you, for spot A, there can be 2 specimens that can be kept. One amongst these 2 specimens that will be kept. It can either be wind pollination by maize, or it can be insect pollination by salvia. Then for spot B, again there are 2 specimens that can be kept. The first one is any of these stages of meiosis 1, or it can be any of the stages of meiosis 2. Then for specimen C, any of these 2 can be kept. It can either be emasculation or it can be bagging, tagging and labeling. Then for specimen D, so for spotting D, there can be xerophytic plants and there can be aquatic plants. So if we study xerophytic plants, there are 3 xerophytic plants that you need to study. The first one is Apantia, and this is commonly known as Nagfani, and you commonly also call it as cactus, which is a xerophytic plant. So this is the first one. Then there is Calotropis procera, which is again a succulent xerophytic plant, or it can be Acacia arabica. So these are the 3 plants that come under xerophytic plants. Then we also spoke about aquatic plants. Aquatic plants, again there are 3 aquatic plants that we studied. The first one is Hydrilla, which is a completely submerged rooted hydrophyte. Then was Eichhornia, which is also known as water hyacinth or Jalkumbi. Now this is a free floating hydrophyte. And then the third one was Typha, which is also known as cattail, and it is an anchored hydrophyte. So this was about the previous session that we have studied. Next, in this session, we are going to start with spot E. Now in spot E, there will be 2 specimens, like one of the 2 specimens that will be kept. And for this spot E, there are 2 experiments. So the experiments will be performed and the specimen will be kept in front of you. You just have to comment about that specimen. You just have to observe it, note down your observation, and then you have to conclude that observation. Now let us see what is the experiment that will be kept. The first experiment is separation of plant pigments by paper chromatography. So in this experiment, we are going to study the separated photosynthetic pigments from the plants. Now, as I told you, you just have to observe the observation, the result, and then you have to conclude the experiment. But for observing it also, you need to know what this experiment is about, what is the procedure of this experiment, though you do not have to write it in the exam, but you need to know the process. So the aim of this experiment is to study the separation of plant pigments by the technique of paper chromatography. So in this experiment, this experiment is actually to separate the plant pigments by this special technique of paper chromatography. It is a special type of paper that is used for this chromatography process. The requirements are you need fresh spinach leaves. Again, you need fresh spinach leaves because you have to extract the photosynthetic pigments from it. You need a capillary tube. Now, capillary tube is something that you must have seen in the chemistry lab. It is a thin glass tube that you use for loading purpose. So capillary tube. Then you need the chromatography paper. Now chromatography paper, the type of chromatography paper that we use is Whatman's filter paper. And even in Whatman's filter paper, we use Whatman's filter paper number 1. Now first of all, what is Whatman's filter paper? This is a special type of a filter paper that provides a range of wet strength qualitative filters, and it also contains a small amount of chemically stable resins that actually improves the high wet strength of the paper. Okay, Now, what is number one? Number one is the grading. So, Whatman's filter paper, they are, distributed, or they are divided according to their grading. And we use, for this particular experiment, we use Whatman's filter paper number one. Then we need 80% of acetone and we need petroleum ether. Now this acetone and petroleum ether is mixed together to form the solvent system. You need MgCl2, that is magnesium chloride, and magnesium chloride you actually add it when you are grinding the fresh spinach leaves that we will be seeing in the procedure. Now MgCl2 or magnesium chloride, it acts as a buffer. Now when we say it acts as a buffer, it enhances the process of extraction of these plant pigments from the spinach leaves. Then you need measuring cylinder, as you can see in this picture over here. You need a beaker, a mortar and a pestle to grind the spinach leaves, and of course the solvent system, that is petroleum ether and acetone, in a ratio of 9:1. Now let us also see the principle behind this experiment. So in this experiment, the separation of the chloroplast pigments, that in this experiment is the solute. It is based on liquid-liquid partition of the pigments in the paper chromatography. Why liquid-liquid partition? Because the solvent that you are using, it is liquid, plus the solute, the extract that you are preparing from the spinach leaves, that is also liquid. So it is a liquid-liquid partition of the pigments in paper chromatography. And the partition takes place between the water molecule that is absorbed to the cellulosic paper and the organic solvent phase. Coming to the procedure of this experiment, the first thing that you have to do is you have to prepare the solvent system. For solvent system, you have to take a ratio of 9:1 of petroleum, ether and acetone respectively and add it into the chromatography chamber. So students, this is the chromatography chamber. After this, you have to take some spinach leaves, and in a mortar and a pestle, you have to add a little acetone to it and magnesium chloride, a pinch of magnesium chloride, which acts as a buffer, and you have to grind it. After grinding, you have to filter it with a muslin cloth. Next, you have to take the Whatman's filter paper number 1 and cut it in a way that you obtain an arrowhead shape of a strip. So if you see over here, this is the shape that you need to obtain. After this, you have to mark a point on this paper, and using a capillary tube, you have to load the spinach extract that you have obtained into this onto this paper. Okay. Now loading the spinach extract on this paper is also a technique that you need to follow. There is a technique for this also. When you load the for the first time, you have to let the spot dry, and only after the spot has completely dried, you will load the second one. And then you have to repeat this process for at least 4 to 5 times. After it has completely dried, then you have to put this chromatography paper into the chromatography chamber, which is already containing the solvent system, and then you have to seal the chamber from the top. After this, you have to leave it undisturbed for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then after 10 to 15 minutes, the solvent will travel to a particular distance on the paper. After this, you remove the paper, let it dry, and see the observation. Now, what is the observation that you see? As you can see in this picture, I have attached this picture of the observation. Now here, the chromatography paper, it shows 4 distinct colored bands. There is this olive green band, there is bluish green band, there is this light yellow color band, and there is this yellowish orange color band at the top. Okay, so this is the observation. And what is the conclusion for this? So what actually happens over here is, the chloroplast of the spinach, it contains 4 photosynthetic pigments. There is chlorophyll B, chlorophyll A, there is xanthophyll and carotene. And these pigments, they travel at different rates along the chromatography paper. Okay, and they travel on the basis of their molecular weight and their solubility in the solvent. So the first thing that you see, the olive green stain that you see, this is of chlorophyll B. Then the second one is of chlorophyll A, that is bluish green. The third one, that is a very light yellow, is of xanthophyll, and the yellowish orange color band at the top that you see, it is carotene. So these are the 4 separated photosynthetic pigment that we have extracted from the spinach leaf. So in exam, this paper or this chromatography jar with the paper will be kept. you have to observe the band and you just have to write the observation and conclusion for it. Okay, but when you're writing it in the journal, you have to write the complete experiment. Of course, this how do you have to write it? I'll be giving you this instruction at the end of the session. Let us see the next experiment that can be kept for specimen E. The next one is comparative study of rate of transpiration using 4-leaf experiment. Now, if you see this picture over here, I suppose that you already know this experiment. This is something that we are doing from our lower classes. This experiment would have been there for you as a demonstrative experiment in your 9th and 10th standards as well. Okay. Now, what is the aim behind this experiment? This experiment is to study the comparative rate of transpiration along the upper and the lower surface of the leaf by this 4-leaf experiment that we do. The requirements are very simple. You need 4 leaves. It can be either of Calotropis or it can be banyan tree leaf. Other than this, you need a Vaseline. You need 2 strands so that you can attach a string onto this 2 strand. Coming to the procedure, the first thing that you do is you take a fresh and healthy leaves of either Calotropis or banyan and then you tie it on the string. Now you have to make sure that when you tie these leaves on the string, you tie them at an equidistance so that every leaf gets exposed to the sunlight evenly. There has to be even distribution of sunlight to these leaves. Now next what you do is you apply Vaseline on both the surface of leaf A. For leaf B you apply Vaseline only on the lower surface. For leaf C, you apply Vaseline on the upper surface, and for leaf D, you do not apply Vaseline at all. And then you have to leave it again undisturbed for about 2 to 3 days. After 2 to 3 days, this is the observation that you see. You will notice that leaf A, it looks fresh and green. Leaf B also comparatively, it looks fresh and green. Leaf C, it will be partially shriveled and partially wilted. And leaf D will be completely wilted. Okay. Now what is the conclusion for this observation? Why do we see this? Why is this result? Leaf A, on leaf A, what did we do is we applied the Vaseline on the upper surface. Okay. And so leaf A, it looks fresh and turgid. Sorry, we applied Vaseline on both the surfaces of leaf A. And so leaf A, it looks fresh and turgid. It looks green even after 2 to 3 days. For leaf B, we applied it on the lower surface. Okay. And to our knowledge, what we know is that maximum stomata are present on the lower surface. And when we have applied Vaseline on the lower surface, that means we have closed or we have blocked the pores of the stomata on the lower surface. And so there was less transpiration and therefore comparatively even leaf B was fresh and it was turgid. Leaf C, we applied Vaseline on the upper surface. Okay. And here the lower surface was exposed and so there was more transpiration, more water loss, and therefore there was partially wilting of this leaf. And if you see leaf D, this leaf, it has transpired freely. There was no Vaseline applied, so there was no pores that were blocked. Okay, so a maximum amount of water is being lost from leaf D. So this is one experiment that can be kept for specimen E. Next, specimen F. For specimen F, you have only this one specimen that will be kept, and this is VS of Anatropis ovule. Now, Anatropis ovule, it is the most common type of ovule which is seen in angiosperm. And the characteristic feature of this ovule is that the ovule is with a bent axis and it bends down in a downward direction where the micropyle is at the lower portion, and so it is called as an Anatropis ovule. Now this ovule, it has two main parts. It has a stalk and it has a body. The stalk of the ovule, it is called the funicle, and the major part of this funicle, it is attached to the body. Okay, it forms a raphe. And the point at which the funicle gets attached to the complete body of this ovule, it is called the hilum. So this part over here, it is called the hilum. When we speak about the body of the ovule, it consists of 5 parts. It consists of the nucellus. It consists of the inner and the outer integument. It consists of the chalazal end, the micropylar end, and at the middle, at the center, there is this embryo sac. Talking about the outer layer, that is the integuments. Now, integuments are two in number, and they are the coverings of this embryo sac. Okay, and it covers the nucellus completely, and it leaves this small gap at the micropylar end. Speaking about the nucellus, it represents the megasporangium of an ovule, and it is made up of diploid parenchymatous cell with one fertile cell which is located at the center. Now this female gametophyte, it is called as an 8 nucleated 7-celled structure. If you count over here, there are 7 cells which are present. So this is 3, there are 3 cells over here and 1 at the center. So this becomes 7. So this is 7-celled 8 nucleated structure. So each of the cells are having one nucleus, and the middle cell, okay, this is having 2 nucleus. This is formed, the secondary nucleus is made by fusion of 2 cells. Okay, so that is how it is called as 8 nucleated and 7-celled structure. The female gametophyte, it consists of egg apparatus, 2 polar nuclei and 3 antipodal nuclei. Okay, so there is an egg apparatus, there is 2 polar nuclei, and then there is 3 antipodal cells. The egg apparatus is located at the micropylar end. So this is the egg apparatus, which is having 2 lateral synergid cells. Okay, and in a mature gametophyte, in the mature female gametophyte, the 2 polar nuclei, that is this at the center, they fuse together to form a diploid secondary nucleus. And so the whole structure is known as 8 nucleated 7-celled structure. Moving to specimen G. Specimen G is the first specimen that can be kept for spot G will be Plasmodium vivax, which is a protozoan. Now this is an unicellular protozoan parasite. It is a parasite which is responsible for causing malaria. And the life history of this Plasmodium, it is completed in 2 hosts. Okay, so partially it is definitive to 1 host, that is human, and then partially it is the intermediate host for this particular protozoan is the female Anopheles mosquito. Okay, now speaking about the infective stage of this Plasmodium, it is sporozoid. So if you see in this picture, half of the life cycle is completed into this female Anopheles mosquito and half of it is completed in the human body. And the infective stage that goes from the female Anopheles mosquito to the human is the sporozoids. These sporozoids, these are 14 microns in length and 1 micron in breadth, and they are motile. So this is the microscopic view of the sporozoids that you can see. They are spindle shaped and the body is covered with pellicule. The anterior part of these sporozoids, they have a apical cap which helps them to penetrate into the host body. And there is a pair of secretory organ that is found below the apical cap. Okay. The anterior part is having an apical cap, and lower to the apical cap, as I told you, there is this secretory body. Other than this, the cytoplasm also contains the nucleus along with the other organelles. Now, when an infected female Anopheles mosquito, it bites a human body, the sporozoids are introduced into the blood, okay, from where they reach the liver of the human. And then they multiply, forming merozoids. Now these merozoids, after few schizogenous cycles in the liver, they enter the RBC and they feed upon the content of the RBC of the body. Once they feed upon the content of the RBC of your body, they disrupt and they destroy the RBCs of your body, and then after 2 to 8 changes in the main blood streams, the merozoids, they become gametocytes. Okay, these gametocytes, they take different shapes and they remain into your blood streams. And when these gametocytes are again taken up or sucked by the female Anopheles mosquito, it undergoes a sporogony again, and then there is a further development and the cycle goes on. Now speaking about the symptoms of this disease, the first thing is that it causes malarial fever, Its infective stage, that is sporozoid, it is found inside the stomach of the female Anopheles mosquito, and it is transmitted to human beings through its saliva when it bites the human. Now, malarial fever, it again occurs in three stages. There is cold stage, when the human body, the patient's body will be very cold and they'll start shivering. The second stage is high fever stage, where the cold stage is followed by high fever with high respiration and fast heartbeat. Then the last stage is sweating stage. In this stage, it is followed by the high fever stage, and the patient will start sweating and the body temperature will fall down to normal. Okay. Other than this, there is extreme weakness due to anemia. Now what happens is, the merozoites, they actually destroy your RBC. Okay, they destroy the red blood corpuscles in your blood, and so there is anemia, and when there is anemia, it will ultimately lead to weakness in your body. In extreme condition, when the parasites have blocked the blood capillaries of the human body, it will damage the spleen, liver, the kidney, the person will die. So this is the extreme case in malaria. The next specimen that can be kept for specimen G, it is Antamoeba histolytica, which is again a protozoan. Now Antamoeba, it is an endoparasite of, and when we say it is an endoparasite, that means it survives and it lives in the human intestine, and it feeds on the digested food that you eat. Now again, Antamoeba, this particular disease, it occurs in three stages. The first one is trophozoite stage, then there is pre-cystic stage, and then the cystic stage. The disease is caused in this trophozoite stage. Okay, so the trophozoite, it is active and it is motile. It is 20 to 30 micron in diameter, unicellular with a single nucleus at the center. Other than this, it will have many food vacuoles, and it will have the ingested red blood cells in the cytoplasm. And then it is also bound with a thin, flexible, semi-permeable membrane which is called as plasma lemma. The cytoplasm is differentiated into two parts. It is ectoplasm and then endoplasm. So the dotted structure that you see, this is endoplasm, and the plain structure that you see at the surrounding, at the periphery, this is ectoplasm. Ectoplasm, it forms the pseudopodium. Now what is a pseudopodium? Pseudopodium, it is a locomotory organ which actually allows this Antamoeba to move, and that is how we say that it is motile, and this is the disease causing stage. If we speak about the reproductive mode of this particular organism, it can either be by binary fission that we usually see in amoeba, where the parent cell, it will divide, and then it will form two daughter cells, and the two daughter cells will then act as a parent cell and further divide and redivide. Or the other mode of reproduction is encystment. What is encystment? Under unfavorable condition, what this Antamoeba does is, it will lose out all the water and it will start forming the cyst in the body. And when the favorable condition occurs, the body, the cytoplasm, okay, the cytoplasm will break, the plasma lemma will break, and all the cysts will come out, and then they act as the main parent body or the parent cell. Okay, so this is by multiple fission and this is the binary fission. So reproduction can be done by two ways. Now the cystic form, this is the non-motile and the non-motile stage, and this is the source of infection. That means when the infection is spread from one human to another, or you can say from one organism to another, it is spread when it is in the cystic form. Okay, and the disease is caused when it is in a trophozoite form. Now speaking about the symptoms of this disease, the first is amoebiasis, or we also call it as amoebic dysentery. The infection is caused due to contaminated food, contaminated water, and this food and water, it is contaminated by the cyst of Antamoeba, and so we say that cystic form of this Antamoeba, this is the source of the disease. It causes abdominal pain, it causes nausea, diarrhea. Diarrhea is with motion which contains blood and mucus in extreme cases. The patient will feel weak and inactive. So this is the second specimen. This particular picture can be kept for specimen G. The next one is Ascaris lumbricoides, which is also called as roundworm, and this is also an endoparasite and it lives in the small intestine of human beings and other animals. This Ascaris, it feeds on or it absorbs the food, the blood and the body fluid from the intestine of the organism. Speaking about the physical appearance of this roundworm, the body is pale white, unsegmented, cylindrical with tapering ends that you can see. The mouth is triangular. You cannot see it very clear in this picture. The mouth actually is triangular. It is having a triangular aperture at the anterior end and it is guarded by three broad lips. Sexual dimorphism. The male and the female of Ascaris, they are different in appearance. So this is one characteristic feature of them. Okay. Now how do you differentiate between them? The male will be smaller in size as compared to female. It will be 15 to 30 centimeters in length, and the posterior end of the male, as you can see over here, it is curved. It is ventrally curved. Okay, and it will show a pair of pineal seta. The female body, it is larger, it is longer as compared to male, and it will measure about 20 to 35 centimeters in length. And the female gonospores, what are female gonospores? They are the genital pores. They will be present somewhere at the mid-ventral line, whereas the posterior end of this female will be blunt and straight. So in males it is curved, the posterior end is curved, and in females the posterior end is straight and blunt. Now, symptoms of this disease, the first one is the person will become infected when the person will ingest the Ascaris egg through food and water. Again, this is also a food and water borne disease. The Ascaris egg, it causes pain in the intestine and the intestinal walls will get eroded. This results into vomiting, diarrhea, constipation and insomnia. Insomnia is sleeplessness. Okay, the person cannot sleep. Then in acute cases, the nervous systems get affected, which causes epilepsy. It can cause unconsciousness or it can cause appendicitis. So what is appendicitis? Appendicitis is when the appendix of your body will be swelled up and it will be inflamed. Okay, and it causes extreme pain. Now this Ascaris larva, during the development, it moves to the liver. It will move to the lungs, the spleen, the kidney, the esophagus, and then comes back to the intestine. These organs, when the Ascaris is traveling to all of these organs of your body, it actually damages the organs in this whole process of movement. Okay, so this is an extreme case. When it travels in your whole body, it will damage all the organs of your body. So this is about Ascaris lumbricoides, which is commonly called as roundworm. The next one is Microsporum andoni, which is commonly called as ringworm, and the ringworm, or which is also called as dermatophytosis, it is not a worm. It is a clinical condition which is caused by the fungal infections of the skin in humans. It is seen in cats, sheep and cattle. The fine mycelium of this fungus, it occurs in the dermis, that is in your skin. It also infects the hair, where the hypha, it emerges from the sheet and it grows up to the hairline. The hypha, it will put fine filaments on the hair surface on which the spores are born. And the spores are very small, it is very tiny and are produced in large numbers. They readily get detached from the hypha and then they will spread the infection to others. The symptoms of this disease. The skin infection, it appears like a flat spreading lesions on your skin. This lesions will be pale color. Then there is scaling and crackling of your skin, especially between your toes. So if the infection is between your toes, there will be this cracking and scaling of your skin that will be observed. Then there is formation of small yellowish cup-like crust on the scalp of your head. Then hair will become grey and it will become lusterless. That means it will appear very dry, and it can also lead to permanent baldness. Then if it infects your nails, the nails will become thick, it will become discolored, that means it will become pale colored, and it will become brittle. Okay, so these are the symptoms if a person is infected by the ringworms. Next, coming to specimen H. Specimen H is again having only one specimen, that is the human brain. Now, human brain, it is divided into three main parts: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. The forebrain, it consists of the olfactory lobes, it will consist of the cerebrum and the diencephalon. The olfactory lobes, as we know, we have studied it in the chapter in the theory of this subject, where we studied the chapter control and coordination. We have studied about the human the human brain, where we studied olfactory lobes. They are highly reduced in the human brain, and the maximum part of this is covered by the cerebrum. Okay, so only the olfactory lobe, it is seen only through the ventral, the downward section of your brain. The upper part is completely covered by cerebrum. Now the cerebrum, it is the largest part of the brain, and it covers about 85% of your brain. Now the function of the cerebrum itself, as we said that it is covering up the 85% of your brain. It is made up of the frontal lobe, the parietal lobe, the occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. Frontal lobe will have the motor area which controls your voluntary actions. That means it will control the muscles of your body. The parietal lobe, it is made up of somaesthetic sensations. That means it is responsible for the sensation of pain, some pressure, temperature, or taste. Then comes the temporal lobe. Temporal lobe, it consists of this is the temporal lobe, which consists of which is a center of smell. So this is where the olfactory lobe is attached or placed. Other than this, it is also responsible for auditory. That means it is responsible for hearing, it is responsible for your speech, and it is also responsible for your emotions. And then the occipital lobe. This is the occipital lobe, which is shown in green color, and this is having only the visual area. Okay, so it is responsible for the sense of vision in your body. So this can be kept, the structure of a picture of brain, human brain, or the specimen of human brain will be kept, and you have to comment about this. Next, moving to specimen I. Now specimen I will have pedigree charts. Okay, you have to study and the prepared pedigree chart of genetic traits. Now the aim over here is to study the pedigree chart for genetic traits such as rolling of tongue, there is widow's peak, there is blood grouping, and then there is color blindness. So the pedigree chart will be kept for these genetic traits, and then you have to comment about it. So starting with the first one, that is rolling of tongue. Now rolling of tongue, it is a genetic trait, and this is caused by autosomal dominant gene. So keeping in mind, this is caused by dominant genes, it is not caused by the recessive ones. So the person who is having a dominant allele of this heterozygous or homozygous condition can roll their tongue. Okay, they can roll their tongue in a shape of a tube. If a person is having a homozygous recessive gene, or who is homozygous recessive, this person can never roll their tongue. Okay, so this pedigree chart will be kept, and you have to comment about this pedigree chart. So according to this pedigree chart, this is the inheritance of the trait. It is autosomal dominant trait. Okay, it is not recessive, it is dominant. The number of normal carrier and affected progeny, the normal progeny is 4, so 4 progenies are affected. Carriers, they are not applicable as it is a dominant trait, so it will not be a carrier. Affected ones are 6. And linkage, if you see, it is an autosomal linkage, it is not a sex linked linkage. Okay, so this was about the first one. The next is widow's peak. Widow's peak, it is a V-shaped hairline which is across the forehead. Okay, and it is again a dominant autosomal trait. It is not a sex linked trait, it is an autosomal trait. Now the gene responsible for widow's peak is again a dominant gene, and therefore both homozygous dominant and heterozygous dominant individuals will have widow's peak. So this is a condition of widow's peak where you will have this V-shaped hairline. And the person who is having a homozygous recessive gene of this particular hairline will not have a widow's peak. They will have a straight hairline, and this particular feature is seen in both in males as well as in females. So again, for this picture or this pedigree chart will be kept, and you have to comment about it. Next is human blood groups. Now human blood groups, they are described as ABO blood group, and the gene that is responsible for controlling this ABO blood group is gene I, which is known as isoglutinogens. Now this gene I, it has three alleles. It has IA, IB and I, that is recessive. Okay. Now the allele IA and IB, they produce a slightly different form of antigen on the RBC of your blood, whereas the allele I recessive, they do not produce any surface antigen on the RBC of your blood, and that is how they are differentiated as a dominant and the recessive ones. Now out of these three alleles, every individuals will have two of them. So two alleles will be present in every individuals out of these three. Now if there are allele IA and IB, this act as a codominant. So they are codominant with each other. So IA and IB are codominant, and individually they are completely dominant over allele I, that is the recessive one. Now there are 6 types of genotypes and 4 types of phenotypes which are seen in the blood groups. These are the genotypes and the phenotypes. So as you can see, if there is IA and IA, this is dominant. Okay, so the blood group will be A. If there is IA and IO, so one is recessive, one is dominant. This is a heterozygous condition. So again, here the dominant will be expressed. So the blood group is A. When it is IB and IB, the blood group will be blood group B, where both of the alleles are dominant. Then again, one is dominant, one is recessive, where IB is dominant and IO, of course, it is recessive. So this is an heterozygous condition where the blood group is B. Then comes codominance, where it is the alleles are IA and IA. So the blood group here will be considered as AB. Okay, so because they are showing codominance. And when the blood group is, when the alleles are IO and IO, the blood group is O, and this is recessive. So you can see that there are 6 different genotypes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 different genotypes and 4 phenotypes. This is 1, homozygous is 1, heterozygous is 1, codominance is 1, and recessive is 1. Okay, so 6 genotype and 4 phenotype. So again, this chart will be kept, and you have to write about the blood group system of the pedigree chart. Next, the last pedigree, that is color blindness. Now this is a sex-linked recessive disorder which is seen in humans, and due to this recessive gene which is present on X chromosome, there is color sensitive cones which are not formed in your body or in your eye, and this results to red and green color blindness. Now this is more common in males as compared to females because it follows a crisscross inheritance. What happens is this particular gene is transferred from the father to the grandson through the carrier daughter. So the daughter, she acts as a carrier, and the carrier daughter will transfer it from her father through her to her son. So it is from the father to the grandson through the carrier daughter. So this is what is crisscross inheritance. Okay. So next, let us move to the other specimens that can be kept for spot eye. Okay. So we are doing spot eye. The first one was the pedigree chart. So any one of these pedigree charts can be kept. If not these, there can be these sections or these specimens, that the slides that can be placed. So the first one is TS of mammalian testis. Testis, it is externally, it is covered by thick fibrous tissues which is called as tunica albugina. So this is a thick fibrous structure that you see, the covering that you see, it is called as tunica albugina. And internally, it is covered by tunica vascularis, okay, which forms the capillaries, and externally it by a incomplete peritoneal covering which is called as tunica vaginalis. Now the testis, it shows a large number of long convoluted seminiferous tubules. So these are the seminiferous tubules that you can see. The various stages that are seen in the development of sperms are like spermatogonia. There is primary spermatocytes, there is secondary spermatocytes, there is spermatids, then the spermatozoa. So these are the stages, various stages that are seen in sperm production. Now large and prominent Sertoli cells, if you see this section over here, okay, the TS section, you will see that large and prominent Sertoli cells are present in between the tubules. And what is the function of the Sertoli cells? They actually provide surface and nourishment to the developing spermatozoa, to the developing sperms. Then there are interstitial cells, which are also called as Leydig cells, and these cells are present in between the tubules. So this is one tubule, this is one tubule, and this is one tubule. In between there are these small Leydig cells which are present. And the function of these Leydig cells are to secrete the male sex hormone, which is called as testosterone. And this testosterone, in turn, they are responsible for controlling the secondary sexual character of the male. Okay. Now, all the stages of spermatogenesis, it can be seen at any time in the seminiferous tubule. Next specimen that can be kept is of TS of mammalian ovary. Now, the mammalian ovary, it is a solid structure which is bounded by germinal epithelium. So, this is the germinal epithelium, and it is covered by a thick layer of fibrous tissues, which is again called as tunica albugina. Okay, so this fibrous tissue that you see is tunica albugina. The ovary, it consists of the outer cortex, and then there is inner medulla region. The cortex contains many oval bodies, which is known as ovarian or the Graafian follicles, and they are seen in various stages. Okay, so various stages of the development of these primary oocytes are seen, the secondary oocytes are seen, and then there is this mature Graafian follicle that is seen. The medulla will consist of the stroma, and this stroma is made up of connective tissues. It is made up of blood vessels and the nerve fibers. Now the cortex contains young and mature follicles. So these are the young and mature follicles that is seen in the cortex region. Each of these follicles, they contain a large ovum surrounded by many layers of follicular cells. Initially, a single layer of follicular cells are seen around each of these oocytes, that is primordial follicle, okay, which is developed into a primary follicle, and this primary follicles then further grows to this secondary follicle, and then the tertiary follicle, and then the mature follicle. Now the cortex, it also consists of a large mass of these yellow bodies, which is known as corpus luteum. So these are the corpus luteum which are present over here. Now these corpus luteum, they are formed by an empty Graafian follicle after the release of the ovum. So once the ovum is released, the empty Graafian follicle will form these corpus luteum, which is taken forward. Now if the ovum is fertilized, okay, if this ovum, it is fertilized, the corpus luteum, it secretes a hormone which is known as progesterone, and this maintains the pregnancy. Okay. And relaxin is another hormone which is towards the end of the pregnancy. Okay, when the female is delivering the child, okay, at that time there is a secretion of one more hormone which is known as relaxin. So progesterone is at the start of the pregnancy, and relaxin is the hormone that is released at the end of the pregnancy. The ovarian cortex may also show white body. So this is corpus albicans, the white body that you see, this is called as corpus albicans, and they represent the degenerating corpus luteum if the ovum is not fertilized. So if the ovum is fertilized, what will happen? Corpus luteum will secrete progesterone, and if the ovum is not fertilized, then the corpus albicans, it will be showing this whitish body, the corpus albicans, which actually represents the degenerated corpus luteum if the ovum is not fertilized. So this is about TS of mammalian ovary. The next one is VS of blastula. Now the embryo in the blastula stage, This is known as blastocyst or blastodermic vesicle, or the other name for this is also coeloblastula. It consists of certain parts. The first part is albuminous layer. So albuminous layer, it is the spherical stage of the embryo with cells in the periphery. So that you can see over here that the cells are at the periphery and the fluid cavity is here at the center. Okay, the outer layer is albuminous. Then the next layer or the next structure is zona pellucida. Zona pellucida is the second layer and it is secreted from the ovum. Then the trophoblast and the trophectoderm, and this is the outer cellular layer of the cells of the blastula next to zona pellucida. So next to zona pellucida there is trophoblast layer. Trophoblast, it means food layer, that is the cells of the trophoblast, it will absorb the uterine milk that is secreted by the endometrial glands, and due to this continuous absorption of milk, the size of this embryo will increase as it receives the nourishment. So the size will increase and increase as the trophoblast is absorbing the nourishment. Then comes the inner cell mass. So this is the inner cell mass that you can see over here, and the mass of these cells are megameres and they are shifted to one side. Okay, so as you can see there is this big cavity of blastocyst over here and these inner cells have moved to one side. So these megameres, they are shifted to one side of the embryo which is called as the inner cell mass. These cells, they form the body of the developing embryo. And then the last one, that is the blastocele. Due to the inner cell mass which is pushed to one side of the embryo, it creates this cavity and this cavity is called as blastocele. Okay, so this is about the VS of blastula. The next one is the last specimen, that is specimen J. So there are some specimens that can be kept as spot J. The first one is kangaroo rat. Okay, so kangaroo rat, it is a xerocele rodent. That means it is found at in the area which is drought prominent area where there is no water. So it is found in such area. So it is a xerocele rodent which avoids heat by adapting nocturnal habits. That means it will adapt nocturnal habits. That means it will be seeing or it will be adapting habits that is that happens during the night time. Okay, why does it do so? That it does so because it can then avoid the heat during the daytime. It lives in the arid and the semi-arid area where the sand is soft, okay, and it is suitable for burrowing. Now what it does is during daytime it will seal the chamber, okay, it will seal the chamber from the top so that when it is inside it can keep itself moist, and it goes into a move freeze mode. Now when it goes into a move freeze mode, it actually reduces predation, okay, at night. It conserves water by lowering its metabolic rate, and thus it reduces the loss of water from the skin and the respiratory system. Now to provide a large amount of moisture in the respiration when sleeping, these kangaroo rat, what they do is they bury their nose in their fur, and when they bury their nose in their fur, they accumulate the moisture from the air. The next one is camel. Camel is again a xerocele animal which is adapted to the desert condition, and they are able to tolerate a wide range of temperature fluctuation and maintain the blood moisture even during the hot day period. Its body temperature, it is unstable, dropping to 33.8 degrees Celsius overnight and rising to 40.6 degrees Celsius in the day. Okay, and when it rises to this particular temperature, the animal begins to sweat. It possesses to lose about 40% of its body weight as water when the animal is sweating. Now it's slender, stout bear, a cleft upper lip, and then there is long eyelashes and muscular nostrils, which actually can be closed for protection from wind blown dust. Okay, so as you can see that the animal is mostly into the desert region and there is always dust which is blown in the wind. So these long lashes and the muscular nostrils, it actually helps the animal to protect itself from the wind blown dust. Its feet is two toes, as you can see over here, there is two toes, and then there is a flesh pad below. Okay, this spreads a lot of sand and it enables it enables the animal to move on the hot and slippery sand. Now the camel, they accumulate the fat on the hump. So this is the fat that is accumulated on the hump. Okay, and they do not accumulate any fat on their body, they accumulate it on the hump. Now this, what this does is this speeds the heat flow away from the body, and as there is a thick coat that prevents the flow of heat inwards. Okay, the hump, it actually acts as a sunscreen, as you can say. It acts as a sunscreen to shield the vital organs of the animal's body. Now this animal also excretes highly concentrated urine. So the urine of this particular animal, this is highly concentrated and it can withstand dehydration by up to 25% of its body weight. Okay, it loses the water from the body tissue rather than from the blood. Then the Henle's loop of the camel, that is the longest. Now the Henle's loop of the camel, that is the longest, it is actually to retain the urea in the body tissue. Camel urinates on its legs. So while urinating, the camel will make sure that it urinates on its own leg, so that evaporation of the urine, it will cause coolness, or it will give coolness in the blood vessels of the animal's leg. Okay, so this is about camel. Next, about the freshwater fish, which is rohu. Okay, the scientific name of this is Labiorohita, and the body of this fish is streamlined and it is laterally compressed. So as you can see, it is laterally compressed from both sides. This is to reduce friction and to avoid swift passage in the water while swimming. It has paired and unpaired fins, which helps in swimming. They also act as stabilizer or balancers. The caudal fins, that is this fins over here. These are the caudal fins that provide a forward push to the body. The fish, it respires by gills, which are specialized breathing organs that use gases that is dissolved in the water. It has air bladders to swim, or the swim bladders, which actually acts as an accessory respiratory and hydrostatic organs to maintain the buoyancy in the water. The body of this fish, it is covered by scales. So these are the scales which are present, and this prevents the entry of water into the body. It possesses lateral lines, or the line system, which functions as a pressure receptors, helping in equalating the objects in the water. So it actually helps in preventing the body of this organism from any obstacles which is coming in front. The eyes have no eyelids, so there is no eyelids, and the eyes are protected by hardened lens. And the animal, or this particular fish, it is a monotelic. And the last one, that is dolphin, that is Delphinus species. So dolphins are mammals and they are not fish. Okay, they give direct birth to their young ones, so they are mammals. The body is smooth, it is streamlined, and it is furless with reduced friction. The snout is beakless. So this is the snout, which is beak-like, and they have a backward curving or dorsal side. Okay, so the back side is curved. The flippers of the dolphins, they control from steering, slowing, and going up and down. The nostrils and the are near the top of the head. Okay, so the nostrils are near the top of the head, which actually allows the surface breathing. So when the dolphin, it has to breathe, it comes on the surface of the water, and through the nostrils it can breathe. It holds its breath while below the water and conserves oxygen while underwater. They have slower heart rate. The body fat is deposited on a thick layer of blubber beneath the skin. This layer, it actually helps in insulating the dolphin, and it acts as an energy reservoirs and also streamlines the body of this particular fish. Now students, this was with this we end with all the specimens that can be kept for your demonstrative experiment for spottings. Now one thing that I need to tell you all is, when you all are writing these demonstrative experiments in your journals, you can write the points that I have mentioned into this video. Okay, you need not write all the points which are there in your handbook. You can mention these points. Okay, so I am not making any kind of PDF for this particular experiment. You just have to write it seeing in this video, or if you write it from your handbook, you have to write all the spottings. So it is all fine if you write it from the handbook as well, but you have to make sure that you draw the diagram for each and every spotting that you write. Okay, the diagram with the well labeled diagram has to be there. Okay, so with this we end with the biology practicals.